First of all, welcome to everybody and anybody that should be watching our podcast. Interestingly, Lent, as much attention as we give it, is one of our last liturgical seasons to develop. It just doesn't seem like that. You'd think that we've had it forever, but it's kind of a latecomer compared to everything else. I'm going to have to back up a little bit because everything that happens in terms of our liturgical year has to be understood in the context of Easter. It says that Jesus rose on the first day of the week, which for the Jewish people was Sunday. Their Monday is our Sunday because, of course, the Sabbath was from sundown on Friday till sundown on Saturday. So Monday was really the first day of their work week, thus the first day of the week. They began, in the beginning, of keeping the meal, and every Sunday was a celebration of the resurrection of the Lord. There was no notion of Easter as a standalone day. They would meet for prayer in the mornings before sunrise, and then they'd go on to their jobs, whatever those were. Then they would gather together again in the evening to share in the meal, or what they called the breaking of the bread. Now, because in Jerusalem especially, where there are threats of insurrection, eventually it'll be the Roman-Jewish War. In 69 AD, the temple is destroyed. There began to be a lot of suspicion about groups meeting at night. So they outlawed nighttime meetings of any groups for any reasons. So for the Christians, that created a problem because they were doing their meal at night. So everything had to be moved up to Sunday morning. So they would have their prayer, the reading of the scriptures, breaking of the bread. They began to do all of that on Sunday morning, and then they would go on to their jobs. So clearly for us, that Sunday becomes very important. The early Christians referred to Sundays as two things, both the first day of the week, the day of the resurrection, and also the eighth day. Now, in Hebrew, there are only so many words, so while it's sort of difficult, I'm not going to say it's easy, but there's a finite number of words in the ancient Hebrew. You can memorize all of them. And so words have to kind of double up. So numbers, not only are they adverbs that tell us quantity, but they also become adjectives that tell us quality. And in the context of adjectives, numbers begin to tell us about the quality of the thing. So 7, I could go through all the numbers, but 7 is something, whenever we see the number 7, are they talking about actual 7 things, or in fact, the number 7 represents, they use it as their adjective for perfect. So, Lord, how often must I forgive my brother? 7 times? Must I forgive my brother perfectly? And then Jesus says, nah, what I tell you is 7 times, 70 times. And of course, with that going on, not only perfectly, it takes on the connotation, you must forgive as God forgives, but in that multiplying, in their minds, it also creates a sense of time, that Jesus is acknowledging we must forgive perfectly, and at the same time, it takes time to do that. Forgiveness is not an event. We just don't say, I forgive you and it's over, because we remember. So it takes time. Forgiveness is something what's the first step in forgiveness is just committing ourselves to the process. That's the first step in forgiveness. So, the number 7. Well, if you want to say something's more than perfect, how do you do that? You add 1. You get 8. So they talked about the 8th day. So the first day of the week talks about the resurrection of Jesus, and then the 8th day, it's the true celebration. Both of them being the same day, the first and the 8th day. So that begins to develop the Sunday. Every day is celebrated, every Sunday is celebrated as Easter Sunday. And so they wouldn't even had a concept of Easter Sunday. Until the late 1st century, early 2nd century, they began to say, maybe we should take at least one of these days and truly commemorate the resurrection of the Lord. Because they began to realize that everything that they were doing, that Easter was the center of everything, that everything began with Easter, and then everything flowed from Easter. And of course, many of them still Jewish, so they're still paying attention to the Passover. And there's a kind of this human longing to start to begin to put those things together. Now, I'm going to back up just a little bit more of an overall thing. We have what we call our liturgical year. We talk about it beginning with Advent. But when we talk about a liturgical year, in the beginning, not just for Christians, but even for the Jewish people, their sense of time becomes very sacred to them. And they talk about, that even in time, God reveals himself. And the first Jewish holy days, if you will, their first high days, are all tied to the passing of time, to the calendar. Somehow everything is attached to the cycle of the seasons. And so they began to celebrate things. They certainly began to celebrate anniversaries, which means births. And that's very common in certain cultures that, if you have a great hero, it became very natural to celebrate their birthday. In their minds, the world began to change the moment this particular person was born. So if we look at all the ancient heroes, Roman literature, Greek literature, even go all the way back to Sumeria at the beginning of recorded history, there's always these great stories about the birth of heroes. Interestingly, it's that very thing that caused Matthew and Luke to add the stories of Jesus' birth. Because in Mark, which is the oldest of the Gospels, there is no story about his birth. Well, that didn't sit well with what they would think of as heroic literature. So Matthew and Luke, and probably after they really have finished their Gospels, go back and add the birth stories. And they serve a lot of purposes. The birth stories, if we had only the Christmas story, if you will, the whole Gospel is contained in the Christmas story. I mean, it's all there, and then the rest of the Gospel kind of plays out what's there. But as they began to look at special days, in the Mediterranean area, they actually have 3 harvest seasons. And so their liturgical year, if you will, their way of celebrating was revolved around these 3 harvest times. In June, they would celebrate harvest of the grain. In September, they would celebrate harvest of the grapes. And then in December, they would celebrate the olive harvest. So they had these 3 cycles of celebrations, which eventually start becoming Feast of Unleavened Cakes. And they take on theological significances later. But they start out with these celebrating the harvest, thanking God for each of these harvests. Now, that's 3/4 of the year, so that leaves a quarter. So they began to celebrate also the coming of spring. So they ended up with what they talked about as the 4 seasons. And they began to put theological and spiritual meaning onto these seasons. As Jewish histories develop, they take some various harvest festivals and other festivals, and they begin, if we have anniversary festivals, that we also have commemoration festivals. So they would be, which we remember events. So, they would take the grain festival, and it becomes the festival of booths, the festival of unleavened bread. We might remember that when Jesus, at the Transfiguration, Peter says, "Lord, let us build 3 booths, one for you, Elijah, and Moses." Well, that's reference to to that feast day. That's the festival of booths, and so which commemorates the time of the Jews in the desert when they lived in tents. That people would erect a tent, a booth, a tent, and they would leave their homes and live in the tent for a little while to commemorate the sojourn in Egypt. That still today, they still do that to some degree. Christians begin to pull this cycle into their faith. And of course, in the beginning, they're doing the Jewish things, but they are sort of, as we would say, they're baptizing those feast days to sort of pull out some kind of Christianity out of these Jewish feasts. But then as they go on, Jesus said and did things that create sort of a whole new understanding. So Christians begin to change their use of time a little bit, and especially as non-Jewish people start becoming Christians, the Jewish arrangement of festivals was meaningless to them. And most especially, as Christianity begins to leave the Mediterranean world, starts to head north up into the Germanic states, starts to head south into Africa, east and west, these places don't have 3 harvest seasons. So it was kind of hard for them to make the leap from these 3 harvest festivals and the Festival of Spring to make the leap into areas of the world where they've got 1 harvest season. So it's so there's evolution going on as Christianity spreads. Start out with the Jewish things, and they begin to kind of move around. Much later in our development, when we talk about holy days, I said they're anniversaries, commemorations, but also we began in especially with Catholicism, Christian Catholicism, we began to celebrate what's called Idea Feast, which celebrates and brings to mind doctrines like the Feast of the Holy Trinity, the body and blood of Christ. We begin to celebrate doctrines that doesn't commemorate any events, but calls to mind certain pieces of our faith. There was a time in the late Renaissance where the Idea Feast far outnumbered commemorations and anniversaries. And the church, especially as they get into Trent, realized this isn't really very good. I mean, we need to kind of move ourselves back and attach ourselves to the rhythms of life that revolve around the person and the teaching of Jesus. We still have a lot of those feasts, but most of our Marian feast, having to do with Mary, most of them, even though we say, okay, we're going to celebrate the birth of Mary, we're going to celebrate the Annunciation, we're going to celebrate the Immaculate Conception, most of those are not really commemorations, they're idea feast. Especially when we talk about the Immaculate Conception, it's the church trying to come to terms with, if Mary was the mother of Jesus, how does a sinless, perfect human being come from a sinful person? How does that work? And so as they worked their way through it, they began to talk about Mary being immaculately conceived. In other words, she's conceived without the stain of original sin. Well, how does that happen? God doesn't live with the constraints of time. So God can take what Jesus is going to do, because with God He's already done it, and can apply it to Mary. That's very simplistically put, but basically that's what the teaching is of Immaculate Conception. So when we do celebrate, we're celebrating a theology and an idea, trying to come to terms with how does a truly perfect human being come from a non-perfect human being. And now, so that's, they begin to work it out. And so we still have a lot of those feasts. Now, with each of these seasons of the year, whether it be around spring, the harvest of the grains, the harvest of the grapes, harvest of olives, as Christians begin to take these things and the Jewish festivals, and then, as we say, begin to baptize them, in order to prepare for them, they begin to develop a sense of fasting, prayer, abstinence, to make themselves spiritually ready to celebrate these big festivals. Many of you, because this didn't change until it started in the 4th century, and it did not change until 1969. So for those of us that have living memory of life before 1969, we remember times of the year that were called Ember Days. The Ember Days were the week before these big festivals. And so to get ready for these big festivals, they would fast and abstain. All throughout Jewish history, we see it in the Old Testament all the way back, fasting was always a part of their spirituality. For those that were at the 8:30 Mass, I talked about in the Jewish mindset, their world, their cosmology, if you will, there are only a finite number of things in the world. And, any sense of unlimited resources they couldn't conceive of it. And I'll use the example like I did at Mass, you'll hear it again at 11 o'clock, I'm sorry. But trust me, with the scaffolding up in the church, it's real dark in there. You can snooze for 10 to 15 minutes as I preach, you'll be great. But the example I used is there are 10 people in the world, there are 10 basketballs. That works out well. 1-to-1. You can cross in front of me, no problem. Or you can pull chairs up. That works too. A couple right there. Now the rocker's available. You all can draw straws to see who has to sit next to Kevin. So, in their mind, there's 10 people in the world because there's a finite number of people, and there are 10 basketballs. It's a finite number, and that works out great. But what if one of those people owned 2 basketballs? Well, that means somebody does not have one. Or if someone owned 3, it means 2 people don't have basketballs. So if someone owned more than someone else, people are being denied, people are going without. And they saw that the same with food. And they're not far off. I mean, there's only a finite amount of food in this world. And as we all know, the vast majority of our food ends up in the Western world, where we have all kinds of great ways of, raising food scientifically and all of that, as opposed to places where they're still using, picks and hoes. But the notion of a fast was that if you had more than other people, when you fast, we think of fasting as just denying ourselves food. Well, for them, it was a much bigger deal than denying ourselves food. It was denying ourselves food and thus giving it away. Not merely just saying, okay, I'm just going to eat one meal today, and the stuff I bought to eat, I'm just going to leave that in the freezer, I'll cook it later. No, and their notion is that food would be given away, because if I have more than someone else, if I fast, someone who doesn't have will get. So they really saw fasting as a way to help create balance, and particularly to assist the poor, which they call almsgiving. Almsgiving can be money, but they really weren't a monetary society so much as, they were a barter. Mostly their economies in the time of Jesus were based on bartering. Hey, I'll give you this sheaf of wheat if you give me that basket of grapes. That's generally how things work, going to market. But fasting was a way of my participation, looking at the way God intended the world to be, Eden, and then participating in that by, I will give up what I have so that someone else can have. Now, fasting for them was a big deal because they barely lived on a sustenance diet. They basically, fruits, breads, cheeses. Rarely did they eat meat. A lot of fish. If they lived, they'd either eat salted fish inland, because that's preserved, or fresh fish, if they lived on the coast. Beef was not generally it was part of the Roman diet, but it was not part of the Mediterranean Middle East diet. They typically did not eat sheep or lamb because they were too valuable for the wool. So if you ate one of your sheep, you were giving up years' worth of income. So that's why when they would offer a lamb, that was a huge sacrifice for them to make to God, because you imagine the sheep live something like 20 years or so. Imagine I think they can shave them twice a year. So imagine 40 bags of wool that you can't sell through time. That was a huge sacrifice. But when they did fast, they really would drop below what was required for sustenance. But it brought somebody up to have sustenance. So, and to them that was very, very important. So the notion of fasting was deeply embedded within the Jewish culture because of these things. And the Jewish people, every Monday and Thursday of every day of the year, every Monday, every Thursday, they would fast. So in some parts of the world, even in the Christian church, that they still have not just Fridays during Lent, where we abstain from meat, but all the Catholics in India, you talk to our Indian priest, they continue to fast every Wednesday and Friday to this day. Now, the Jewish fast was Monday, Thursday. Initially, the Christians are Jewish, so they continue that and they begin to sort of Christianize it. But as time goes on and we start to get a lot more Gentiles, where the Gentiles start to outnumber the Jewish people, they didn't have those same kinds of sensibilities. So they swapped their days from Mondays, Thursdays to Wednesday, Fridays. Became their fast days. So the whole Christian community. Now, if you were still Jewish, you had a tendency to try to do all of them, but over time it just became every Wednesday and Friday. Now, the development of all of this kind of stuff, it's not like it's happening everywhere at once. Some things start to develop in this city. And it really is kind of neat. Hey, we'd kind of like what, you go visit Venice, it's like, hey, we kind of like what they're doing there on, this particular day of the year. So they begin to take what they saw in Venice and take it back to their own town. And then somebody takes it to another town. So things begin extremely locally and then slowly begin to expand. Some things catch on and become worldwide, and eventually in Rome they say, okay, this is it, we're all going to do it. Or they say, no, this doesn't make much sense, we're not going to do it. When the church splits between Rome and Constantinople, there was always kind of a butting of heads, because the Roman church would accept something and the Eastern church would say no way, or the Eastern church would accept something and the Roman church would say no way. So, we're still the same, but yet there is some pretty good divergences in there as well. So down in Egypt, while they're in Egypt, the Christians in Egypt, they began with this notion of, the kind of the role of their, let's just call it their liturgical year, although they wouldn't call it that, but their kind of ebb and flow of the seasons. One of the things they began to commemorate in the life of Christ was his 40 days in the desert. Had nothing to do with Lent, nothing to do with Easter, but they wanted a commemoration. So they began to fast and abstain and add rituals celebrating the 40 days in the desert. Hey, people kind of liked it. It begins to spread a little bit. Eventually, it truly enters into Europe, and a lot of people began keeping this commemoration of the 40 days in the desert. Now, simultaneously, all this stuff's happening at the same time. Simultaneously, the Christian community, especially in Europe, kind of in the Roman Empire areas, or what was the Roman Empire, they really do begin to want to celebrate a particular day to be a true commemoration of the resurrection of Jesus. Not just every Sunday, but to have one day that they celebrate the actual historical resurrection of Jesus. Well, then the great debate begins. When do we do that? And initially, it's kind of they had 2 days that they would celebrate Easter. And there was a huge division within Christianity all over the place. I mean, you were either this or you were this. They either celebrated the Jewish 14th day of Nisan, which is Passover. Remember, the Roman calendar has 14 months, I believe, instead of 12. And it's a lunar-based calendar, not a solar-based calendar. So there's a whole section of the world that wants to make the Jewish 14th day of Nisan the celebration of Easter, which would always be, really kind of always fall on that particular Sunday because of the way they did Passover. And that's, when they wanted to celebrate it. The rest of the world wanted to be a little bit more scriptural, and this is where it gets a little bit iffy here. They wanted to celebrate on the first day of the week because the scriptures say that Jesus rose on the first day of the week. So it's going to be a Sunday. Well, which Sunday? Well, obviously it has something to do with Passover. Somehow the death of Jesus is connected to Passover. So it would always be the first Sunday after Passover. So sometimes that would coincide, 14th day of Nisan or the first Sunday, the first day of the week after Passover. we think, well, they get in these arguments, they kind of worked it out. Yeah, they worked it out. I mean, people died at the end of a sword over these things. I mean, they were serious about their theological arguments. Well, then a problem developed for those that embraced the 14th day of Nisan. As the Western world becomes predominant, particularly the European world, the world moves away from a lunar calendar and begins to adopt the solar calendar. Well, what do you do now when your calendar is based on the sun rather than the moon? Now we have a whole new argument on when are we going to celebrate Easter. Over time, they in some areas, this became the way of working it out is that they kind of came up with the formula. And in 325 AD, at one of the most important early councils of the church, the Council of Nicaea, they came up with the instruction that Easter would be celebrated on the Sunday that follows the first full moon after the spring equinox. So Easter is still set by the lunar calendar, not the solar calendar. So it's always, if you want to know when Easter is going to be, you could look up when's the first full moon, after the spring equinox, and then just look at the next Sunday. You'll always be able to figure out the day of Easter. I just look on the internet; it's a whole lot easier. But so in 325, it becomes set, and that's how we do it still today. Now, a little bit later in history, as we get into the 1,000 years, there is a movement that wants to move away from this constantly moving date. And let's just pick a date. And we're going to celebrate Easter on this date. So Easter is no longer a movable feast, but a set feast. And so the biggest proponents of doing that, as they talk, they settle on, of all days, April 1st. At that time, nobody talked about April Fools. They just, for whatever reason, they wanted April 1st. But as the argument developed and went back and forth, and it would take another church council to kind of settle this, and then they rely on Nicaea in 325 and they stick with it. Well, there were those that, they were going to stick with April 1st, so they didn't go with the whole church, started going off and doing their own thing. Remember, this is April 1st. So they began to be referred to as the April Fools. So, our world is so Catholic, it just doesn't know it. So Easter gets set. Now we've got this 40-day fast that's very popular. And the way it works out, when they were celebrating it was so close to Easter, it became just sort of a natural evolution for it to move a little bit, and it becomes a preparation time for Easter. But prior to that, we have Easter is set. Well, they're still not thinking in terms of preparation. They're thinking in terms of the first days of Holy Week as preparation time, but not these 40 days. The first thing that actually developed was 50 days of celebration after Easter. And if Jesus, the number 4, remember what I said about numbers, the number 4 has a sense of quality of something that it's enough. So 40, it's enough time or enough of this. It's enough to accomplish a task. So Jesus spent 40 days in the desert. What does that tell us? He spent enough time to accomplish what he went there to do. Well, if you do all this number stuff and you want to make something better, you add to it. Well, the Jewish celebration of Pentecost, which they celebrate on Pentecost, the giving of the Torah. Moses went up on the mountain for 50 days. He came down with the 10 Commandments. So on Pentecost, the Jews celebrated the giving of the Torah. So Christianity, again, kind of baptizing things, it works out that, you do, now we've got Easter set. It just worked out that 50 days later was the Jewish feast of Pentecost. So now we've got Pentecost, and the word Penta is Greek for 50, the 50 days. The Jewish world is celebrating the giving of the Torah. Well, when we baptize it, what are we celebrating? The coming of the Holy Spirit and the giving of a new law. When Luke talks about the tongues of the fire that appeared as tongues of flame over the heads of the apostles, well, that what he's describing is the symbol they used to represent the Torah, which was a flame. So the appearance of the flame over the apostles, there's a new law in town now. This is new. And of course it's, now the law of Christ. So, Luke is he's taken all of these well understood beliefs and folding them all together to teach us. When he talks about the sound of the wind, the sound of a mighty wind, well, the mighty wind's outside, and the word he initially uses, kind of the word he uses is, it's really windy outside, and in the house we hear a little whistling, and that lets us know that it's a huge wind out there. Well, that's what he's talking about, that little whistle of a sound, which also happens to be the words in there that describe God breathing into the nostrils of the human so that the human may have life. So the coming of the Holy Spirit is literally the coming of the breath of God on Pentecost, redoing, what we read in Genesis about the creation of man. So we've got, this balance. This happened, it was broken, now God has redone it. We celebrate it on Pentecost. If we go a little bit further, it says on that Pentecost day when they left that upper room and began to preach, everybody talked about how they were speaking in languages that they did not know originally, and everybody understood them. Well, what's that balance out? The Tower of Babel, where human arrogance, hubris, and all of that, God punished all of that by creating the division based on different languages. Now, again, just sort of as an aside, when Luke talks about these men being able to speak in languages that everyone understood, that is not the gift of tongues that we would talk about today. Paul talks about the gift of tongues. The Greek word is glossolalia. Paul does talk about that, but that's not what happened in Pentecost, because if you were raised in Galilee, which most of these men were, every major trade route ran through Galilee. So for you to survive in Galilee, it's like if you lived on the border of Italy, Switzerland, France, and Germany, you spoke, to this day, you speak all those languages fluently. You have to, because you drive down into that block, you're in France. You drive down into that block, you're in Germany. You drive down into that block, you're in Italy. It's a little bit of an exaggeration, but we see that today. All kinds of people in Europe grow up speaking multiple languages. And, it used to be that French was the language of diplomacy and the international language. Well, now it's English. So, whether there's, they may not be close to Britain, but every child takes English. They grow up naturally learning these different languages, but they have to learn English. So when we talk about most of these apostles being from Galilee, they grew up speaking multiple languages. So the miracle is in Pentecost is not so much that they were able to speak in these languages. The miracle is they were given the gift of being able to preach and for people to understand what they were saying. It's a gift of preaching and a gift of understanding and comprehension. That's the gift of the Holy Spirit. So that's what we're looking at. Kind of off the track. But so the days after Easter develop first, and then Pentecost. Well, they start looking at the celebration of some of these other things, and they begin to develop, a special day. Now, Christmas is very late in the development of our holy days. It's very, very late. But when they do settle on a date to celebrate the birth of Jesus, well, they add what's called an octave. Again, if 7 is perfect, you add 1, you get 8. That's the word octave. So we have several celebrations where we have octaves. Octave of Christmas, octave of this, octave of that. Well, what does that mean? It means that for 8 days, every celebration we have after Christmas, every day we celebrate Christmas for 8 days. Every prayer prays on this day when Jesus was born. Not like we're looking back. It's now, for 8 days, we celebrate Christmas. So they add the octaves. So all of this stuff is it's getting pretty developed and pretty entrenched. But then, when they celebrated Easter initially, they celebrated on one day the Passion, the Death, and the Resurrection. It was all celebrated on one day. Well, 3 separate events all get rolled into one, and in the mind of the church, then and now, you cannot talk about one without talking about the others. The Passion, the Death, and the Resurrection. You have to talk about all of them together. But in order to be able to truly focus on these things, slowly they begin to kind of tease it out, and we end up with Good Friday and the Easter Vigil. And then we, later on, and it's a little bit later, we end up with Holy Thursday, Good Friday, Easter Vigil. These things start to be separated. And then Holy Thursday, then they'd move to Wednesday, and Holy Thursday fell out. So, it's, ever evolving. But then, as this is spreading around the Christian world, and finally Rome begins to say, okay, this is the way we're going to do it, then, at that point, because they have a whole history of getting ready for fasting and abstinent for special days, back to those Ember Days, celebrating the 4 harvest feast, which had always been part of Jewish culture. The Jews fasted and abstained to prepare for all kinds of things, and the men would fast and abstain before marriage, they'd fast and abstain before a birthday. That was so much a part of their culture that 40 days of Jesus in the desert starts to become not the 40 days in the desert so much as it becomes 40 days of preparation. Now, the numbers varied a little bit. Sometimes some areas it'd be a week, some areas it'd be 2 weeks. And then we kind of get set on the 40 days. And they would count back from Easter Sunday 40 days, and so you would have the first Sunday of Lent when Lent began. But at the same time, they began to develop, earlier than this, they began to develop a sense of, you never fast and abstain on a Sunday. That's a day of celebration of the resurrection of the Lord. And so there had always been this sense of, no, we do not fast and abstain on Sundays for any reason. So, at first they're sort of forgetting that, but then, within a matter of about a century, they're saying, why are we fasting and abstaining on Sundays? So they said, we're not going to do that. So what happens? Holy Week, they firm it up so it ends, so that Lent officially ends with the beginning of Mass on Holy Thursday. But if you take the Sundays out, so now we've kind of added a little bit more time in there, because like I said, they backed up to Wednesday, did a couple other things. And then they said, well, to do this, we need to add a few days on the front end. So if you count back and take Sundays out of the fixture, what do you get? Wednesday. So thus Lent, it became set. This did not become set until the 11th century. So all of this time, the way people looked at things, the way people lived, it's constantly evolving. We think of it as just sort of set. But no, it's constantly evolving. And it's really not until the Council of Trent that everything is just codified. And it stays with us until, there were some early reforms of Holy Week back in I can't remember, the 1950s. They reformed the celebration of Holy Weeks. But all the stuff, and then all of the stuff that kind of got piled on through the years, all the extras, did not get reformed until 1969. So we're talking about Trent, in the 11th, 13th century, right in there. Everything is set in place, so the church celebrated this way all the way to 1969, when under Paul VI, our liturgical calendar was completely redone and renewed. Now, it wasn't that they were throwing out centuries of practice. No, they were throwing out all of the stuff that started piling on and getting added that distracted from the original purpose of doing it. So one of the things they actually start to restore to Lent in the Second Vatican Council is something, again, that had been developing over time as people around the world, Christians around the world, begin to see, oh gosh, they've added this, now we got to do this, and now we got to do this, and this special day during Lent, we got to do all these things. The purpose of Lent begins to get lost. Why we do this gets lost in the mixture. And so there was, beginning in the 18th century, really heavily in the 19th century, and then all of the theology it just kind of explodes, in the 1940s, 1950s, and the leading up to the Second Vatican Council, which began in 1962. If we back up just a little bit, one of the most significant times of the formation of the theology of the church happened during the Second World War, because the church had to deal with concept of evil, had to deal with a church where priests were just not available anymore because they were going into the concentration camps, they were being executed. It's actually in Auschwitz that the whole notion of restoring the diaconate begins. They would put the priest with everybody else, and then the priest, they were fermenting whatever kind of fruit they could get. They would ferment it. Now it wasn't grape wine, but they would ferment whatever they could, and they'd get little pieces of bread that people would steal from their food, and so they were celebrating Mass. Well, when the guards caught on, oh no, we're not going to have any of that stuff going on. So they began to put all the priests in a special building, their priester block, or the priest block. This is where we keep all the religious people, so they cannot celebrate the sacraments or any other religious thing for all of these people in the concentration camps. So there were 2 priests that were imprisoned there in Auschwitz, and in the priester block. And it's that experience of a church without priests that they began to resurrect the notion of the diaconate. And we had deacons before we had priests. We had deacons and bishops. Priests came a little later, so bishops were priests, but every city, every town, every few blocks there were a bishop, so the notion's a little bit different. But as the church began to leave cities and the bishops couldn't get around all the churches, it's then the notion of somebody acting in the name of the bishop, the priesthood. There were priests, sort of, but so that becomes a big deal. And at that point, the diaconate begins to fade. It becomes just a step to the priesthood. So everything is evolving constantly in the church, and so much becomes a response to what's going on in the world at the time. Originally, for example, if we look at our own cathedral, originally the bishop would sit in the center of the apse. They would say, oh, it's not like a king, it's not a throne, it's just more like a person with authority. But of course, it was kind of hard to lose that connotation, when you have something that looks like a huge throne room and there's this humongous chair and this man's wearing all those funny clothes sitting in it. But as the development of altar furnishings and how a sanctuary is set up in the old Roman Empire, and especially in Rome, they would build churches on an east-west axis because you said Mass facing the rising sun, because it was always said that salvation would come from the east. So, we would say, oh, I remember when the priest said Mass with his back to the people. Well, the notion was, even though our churches weren't being built on east-west axes in our lifetime as a rule, the notion was, no, we're all facing east. The priest is facing east, the whole community is facing east. So that was the notion. Well, if your church is east-west axis and you're doing that, the bishop's chair began to be moved. So it's moved and it's moved and it's moved, so that when the bishop sits in his chair, he's not facing east, the bishop is facing north. Why? It was this church's way of, with all of these invasions and barbarians, it's a way, if you have the bishop facing north, it was a way of saying the bishop is teaching the barbarians. The bishop is he represents Christ defending us. And so in a cathedral, again, we're not built on east-west axis, but that's how in a cathedral the celebrant's chair ends up on the side of the church where it is, like in our cathedral now. because the time would have been where the bishop faced. And then the pulpit reversed, because in parish churches, as we're looking at the altar, parish churches, the pulpit or the ambo is on the left, but in a cathedral it's on the right. Why? Because if the bishop now is sitting on that side looking north, the ambo is to his back, so they move it. So he can hear the word of God proclaimed to him. And then also, and a lot of people don't realize this, when we were doing some renovation, everybody would very much like to see the tabernacle restored to the center of the church, which is very common in the parish churches. But in a cathedral, you're forbidden from having a tabernacle in the middle for two reasons. One is simply that a bishop may never celebrate Mass with his back to the tabernacle. That's reason number one. Reason number two is that the vision of the church for a cathedral is that it's used more than just for Mass. So if you're going to have community meetings, if you're going to have if you're going to have prayer with all these different denominations coming, it gets to be a little awkward having the tabernacle right there. So the instructions, both canon law and the instructions building in churches, cathedrals are always to have a separate chapel for the Eucharist. So it doesn't have to be taken out of the. So we don't have to take Jesus out of the tabernacle every time the bishop says Mass, or every time we have an ecumenical prayer service or something like that. So things begin to evolve again. The notion of the church in the Second Vatican Council was to go back to the beginning and to restore the Jewish sense of fasting, almsgiving, and prayer. And our Lent today is based on that spirituality. In the mind of Jesus, you cannot separate fasting, almsgiving, and prayer. In the mind of Jesus, it's one act. Even though you would do it at different times, they cannot be separated. Fasting is meaningless unless someone else profits. Most especially, it's almsgiving for the poor. Fasting and almsgiving is meaningless unless we put it in the context of doing what Jesus did. Therefore, it requires prayer. So each piece, the fasting is important, but it comes special when it's connected to the poor. And doing both of those things become incredibly, not that they're absolutely meaningless or worthless, far from it, but they become especially meaningful when in prayer we're dedicating the action to God, and in prayer we're mindful of this is why we're doing it. We're doing it to imitate Jesus Christ, who the Scriptures tell us constantly that there was fasting, almsgiving, and prayer. Now, abstaining from meat was something kind of new. And to all of this, it didn't develop until the middle centuries, but it goes back to that sense of we don't want to. It began just with Fridays. Remember that saying they fasted from the beginning. Christians would fast on Wednesdays and Fridays. Well, they began to abstain on Fridays because that's the day Jesus died. They didn't want to be eating red meat on the day Jesus died. It became a way. It sounds kind of ghoulish, and the way they would have described it, it does sound really ghoulish. But it's we're not as earthy as those early centuries are. We have a lot more kind of sensitive feelings about things. But that's kind of the purpose. It becomes a way to acknowledge that on this day we do something different because it's the day Jesus died. So instead of having a T-bone on Friday, we'll go to Red Lobster and have lobster instead. So, in keeping with fasting, almsgiving, and prayer. So, when we do ponder Lent, beginning on Ash Wednesday, and the use of ashes goes all the way back to the Old Testament, where the Jewish people were incredibly hygienic. They washed their hands before they did anything. They didn't understand bacteria, viruses, germs. They didn't understand any of that stuff. They had no clue. But what they did catch on to is that, hey, if I wash my hands before I eat, I usually don't get sick. Whereas almost every time I don't wash my hands, I get really sick. Or if I wash my food, if I wash the fruit before I eat it, I usually don't get sick. If I don't wash the fruit, I end up vomiting and diarrhea. And I mean, so they catch on. I mean, these are people of nature. I mean, so they catch on to the rhythms and the movements and how things work together. And so with a lack of understanding of what really is going on, just taking care of bacteria and viruses and germs and all that, what they begin to say is, begin to believe that somehow this is what God wants us to do. So it becomes kind of set. And that to not do that, that's why the Jews are so bumfuzzled when Jesus' apostles, disciples, don't wash their hands. Well, that wasn't very hygienic, obviously, but at the same time, Jesus has to reorient them about why do we do these things, and and that I could give a whole other talk on why Jesus was constantly reforming some of the things the Pharisees were asking people to do, but anyway, all of this stuff, again, it starts to get pulled back in. Now, if they were very hygienic, if they bathed on a regular basis, if they kept their clothes incredibly clean, how do you say something to the opposite? You wallow in the mud, you become really dirty. So the use of ashes became an outward way of doing penance. Is it an outward way of saying, I am not spiritually clean? So that the use of ashes begins. It's the opposite of being hygienic and bathing and washing your hands. And so, what's the dirtiest thing you can do is smear all this ash stuff all over you, which after a while it's hard to get off, since they didn't have soap the way we had it. So that becomes also incorporated as a beginning of Lent, as a way of saying to us, we're here to try to do our best to be clean, to repent, change our lives. Okay? Absolutely.
What's the distinction between fasting and abstaining? I think fasting, I remember.
Fasting is when we give up an amount of food.
Oh, okay. It's not.
Abstaining is when we don't eat meat.
Oh, okay.
And that's the difference.
When I was growing up, we couldn't eat midnight till the.
And that's a fast.
That's a fast. We don't eat anything.
Right, from midnight until you receive communion. That was the fast.
Right.
And then they shortened it to 3 hours.
Right.
And then now it's an hour. But
so fasting isn't just giving up food totally.
For Lent, we define fasting as having one meal a day, but we're allowed to have a couple snacks that don't total another meal. And the original fast would be from sundown, or from sunup to sundown, and they would eat their meal after sundown. So they'd go the whole day without. But again, we do have health issues. People do have diabetes or other things. If I go too long without eating, I get migraines. So they said, okay, you can still have a couple little snacks throughout the day, but it needs to be a clear difference in the amount of food that's consumed on that day.
On that part about Sunday, worshiping on Sunday, doesn't that go against keeping the Sabbath holy?
Well, initially they're talking about the Sabbath, which would be sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. But as the Christians begin to celebrate Sunday, they just take that rule and slide it over, so that for the Christians, the Christian Sabbath is sundown Saturday to sundown Sunday. So they take a practice and they just, rather than applying it to the Jewish Sabbath, they begin to apply it to what the Christians never use the term Sabbath of Sundays. That never happened. But basically they take that rule, and the point of that rule, to keep holy the Sabbath, the point of that rule is, it used to be very strict. You couldn't work. I mean, the Jewish scriptures in Leviticus, Deuteronomy, they even describe how many steps you may take on the Sabbath. Otherwise it's considered work. But the notion is that whatever you do on that day, God is to be the focus. So you don't do, some people may mow the yards and all that. Well, some people enjoy it. So it's, it's work, but, sometimes for people it's, the mower's making a lot of noise. Nobody can bother me. I'm in my own little zone. I mean, but anyway, the notion is to keep holy Sabbath is to be mindful of God on God's day, which happens for us Christians to be Sunday, if that helps.
So we're like going against the Ten Commandments?
No, because it's just adapted, because after a while, Christians, remember, there came a point at which Christians were, by the vast majority, had no Jewish roots whatsoever. So that commandment meant nothing to them. It became a point where Christians never even heard of a Jew, especially when you get up and to the northern kingdoms and Germany and all those areas. They haven't even heard of a Jew. So for the commandments to make sense, they take the same commandment but apply it to the Christian holy day as opposed to the Jewish holy day. And so it still applies, but we apply it to Sunday.
So most Catholics don't sacrifice Lent on Sundays, right?
Right. That would be the notion. We do not fast and abstain on Sundays. Now, we all give up something for Lent. Some people keep it going throughout the entire of Lent. Some say, "Oh boy, it's Sunday. I can eat my chocolate and have my Coca-Cola." But and remember, giving up something for Lent is not a rule. It's a personal discipline we're encouraged to accept, and then how we do it, that's up to us. I remember the George Carlin routine. How many people went to hell on a meat wrap, and then all of a sudden we don't have to fast we don't have to abstain every Friday anymore. So it's, but that's a personal discipline. Giving up something for Lent. All right, folks, we got Mass in 12 minutes for those of us that have to be there, and trust me, I have to be there. Thank you all.